Just to introduce myself, my name is Barry Hiern. I'm part of the Oracle Digital Assistant Product Management team. So what we're going to be looking at today, as you plan your ideas around sort of the hackathon, is really how we can use conversational interfaces to make the access to the underlying data and applications that things like citizens might want to do through the use of a conversational interface. So let's start. Well, if we look at sort of the generations of building user interfaces for applications, back in the sort of the 1990s, it was all about building websites. So everything had a website. You'd have multiple websites, and often there was the problem of just too many websites. Then back in around 2008, suddenly we had a fundamental shift towards the use of mobile phones or smartphones, and in particular, the move to mobile apps. Now, there is another generational change going on, and that's really looking at the idea of a set of these conversational interfaces and basically chatbots. So the question is, why has there been this change, and what do they really bring to the picture? Well, one of the reasons conversational interfaces are becoming important is basically they use a metaphor that we've all been using since we were children, which is to have a conversation. So rather than having to learn how the application works, and that's particularly important when we're looking at like a G2C environment, the application basically understands what the user's trying to achieve and then takes them to the right place. In terms of why they're taking over from mobile apps, well, a lot of it comes down to app fatigue. There's no need to download or proactively go and find the app. You're ultimately going to be using an interface that they probably already have, be it a WhatsApp or a Slack or sort of WeChat or whatever. You're basically using an app they're already using. So therefore, there's really no additional app to download. So not only are we allowing them to do it in a way that they would inherently want to, i.e. Ask the question, they are going to be using what they have. And there's obviously a lot more channels than just mobile phones and websites, based on the idea that the application is going to be where the user is, rather than the user having to proactively come to the application. And ultimately, there's going to be one sort of consistency across the application, because in many ways, there is no interface. The best interface, when it comes down to it, is going to be one where the user themselves drive the interaction. So as I mentioned, app fatigue. But even when we look at a conversational interface, there's lots of different ways we can ask the same question. So we also have to take into account the nature of those questions and how they fit with the application we're trying to build. Now, there are multiple styles of conversation that you can build within a conversational interface. The easiest one to start with is really that sort of single turn FAQ, where we can effectively take the FAQs that might be on the website and turn it into a dynamic FAQ, where based on the question, the user has the response of the answer most appropriate to their question. We can then look at things like transactional bots, where we're effectively looking at the data from the back end and basing it on the user themselves. So in the case of, say, an FAQ may be a generic answer, whereas where we're doing a transaction, it's all about my information. So my street, my garbage collection, etc. So whereas we might have what's the timing of the garbage pickup, that would be a generic answer. but when is it from my street is obviously a transaction in terms of going in to get the data. Now, particularly when we're dealing with government systems, there's frequently the need for regulatory or policy-driven conversations. So in this case, you can think of it as rather than the end user asking the question, it's the bot asking the user the question. So it's gone from being user-driven to effectively chatbot-driven conversation. And that way the bot will ask the appropriate questions to walk through a given process. And hence, when we come out at the end of it, we've made sure that we have the appropriate information that's going to address a policy or a regulatory requirement before we actually go and process it. Now, in reality, you're never going to be able to cover every type of conversation that a user wants. So this is where the idea of, if you like, man in the middle comes back into the picture. So the ability to basically hand off to a live person if the bot isn't able to answer the questions. That way, rather than having a frustrated user, you're going to have a situation where if the bot can't answer the question, it gets handled by an actual human who then can take it up. But the important part there is it's within the context of the same conversation. So rather than simply passing them a link, you're actually effectively taking over the conversation from the bot. Now, as I said, the last option really is who's driving the conversation again, but in this case, who starts the conversation. So application event-driven conversations are effectively, think of it like push notification. There's an event that's happened in the application, and you basically want to reach out to the end user and start the conversation with them, rather than having the end user start that conversation. So these are the 5 different styles of chatbot conversation that you tend to see when you're building an implementation with a chatbot, particularly, as I said, in anything that is G2C. But when we look at building a conversation, one of the fundamental problems, and one of the things that will make or break the conversation as far as the chatbot's concerned, is the fact that as people, we don't tend to speak in a robotic linear fashion. So if I was to ring up a call center, for example, I might ask an initial question, but before the agent managed to answer that, I may ask a different question that just occurred to me. And again, there may be more and more questions, but either way, I don't expect the agent to forget the original question that I asked them. So in that sense, they should be able to go off and answer that question after they've asked all the others. So building a successful chatbot really also looks at, or needs to look at, this ability to effectively go off topic and allow people, or have a non sequitur, if you like, and basically handle what's ultimately different FAQ questions, different processes, and yet still address the reason the user came to the chatbot in the first place. And to make it even more fun, when we look at talking to other people, 40% plus of our conversation isn't really tied into the thing we're talking about in the first place. It's what's referred to as small talk. And the same thing happens with chatbots. So you have to be able to, if you like, handle the concept of small talk. Simple things like, what's the weather? Tell me a joke. Are you a bot? All of these types of questions that inherently come in there. And the reason we want to handle those is actually psychological. Because if you can't answer the question, are you a bot, or something of that nature, in other words, if you can't answer the irrelevant questions, the user may not have the same confidence that you can actually answer the questions which are within the business domain. So it's always important to be able to handle both domain and out of domain conversations as you build up that chatbot. So let's get to the digital assistant itself. So first of all, why is a digital assistant different to a classic chatbot? So if we look at first generation chatbots, they were fundamentally designed around a single use case. And the reason they were pretty much a single use case was the NLP, or the natural language processing, the AI, wasn't sufficiently good enough to really handle all the different topics you might throw at it. So rather than, because if you try and put too much information into the one bot, it basically can't work out what your intent is. It can't work out what your goal is. And hence it actually becomes less effective. So what you inevitably ended up with is a plethora of bots. So you might have the HR bot, the help desk bot, my expenses bot, and so forth. And in many ways, it became the same sort of pattern that happened with the early websites, is you'd end up with lots and lots of websites, and you honestly didn't know which one to go to get the answer. And back then, we came up with the concept of a portal, where a portal, web portal, really was the ability to aggregate all these different websites into a single interface, such that you only needed to go to the portal to get all the information rather than having to go to the individual websites. You can look at a digital assistant much in the same way, and that a digital assistant really is a super bot, and its function is to work out which of the individual bots, or what's referred to as a skill, will actually answer the question. So each one of those hexagons or skills is effectively a standalone bot that has within it its own NLP, its own conversation flow or dialogue flow, and all the thing and the integration into the back-end applications, such that it's effectively self-contained. And in fact, we could even run that skill by itself as a standalone bot. The advantage of the digital assistant is its function is to disambiguate the question and work out which of those skills best addresses the intent of the user, and then to pass control to that. The advantage here is each one, I don't need to build one bot with all the domain knowledge for all the different use cases. Each one is effectively self-contained, and we plug them together much like Lego blocks to build this super bot, if you like. So effectively, what it means is each of those back-end applications can be exposed by individual skills, and then that in itself, that aggregate, is exposed as a single bot to whatever channel we choose, be it a voice channel like Alexa, but like Google, like Oracle's own voice, or things like WhatsApp, Slack, Microsoft Teams, etc. So effectively, just to put that a different way, the digital assistant is in many ways an intelligent router. What it's going to do, as I said, it's going to take that incoming message, it's going to work out what the message is about, and then it's going to look at all the skills that are registered with it and said, okay, that skill is most appropriate to address this. I will pass control to that skill. Now, the digital assistant also handles the non-sequitur. So if I'm halfway through a request and I give a different utterance or a different input, it's going to process that and basically call another skill. So what it's able to do is effectively interrupt our current process, passes to the new process, finish that process, and importantly, come back to where we were before and pick up. So it's not like, say, an Alexa, where when you call a skill, you're effectively forgetting what you did before and going to a new skill. In this case, you're effectively parking the first skill, going to the new one, processing it, and then coming back to where you left off in the original process. And this way, the digital assistant's able to move you between the different functions and different sort of use cases and allow the user to think in a much more humanistic manner. But as I said, skills themselves are the workhorses of a digital assistant. So these are the smart Lego blocks that have all the logic in, all the natural language processing required to execute a particular conversation or business conversation. So all the natural language processing, be it the natural language understanding as well as the dialogue flow, is wrapped up inside one of these skills. And that way we can basically just plug it into the overall bot. And that way, if someone asks a new question, it can route to that skill that we've just plugged in. So how do we go about building them? Well, I'll show you the builder itself, but fundamentally it's a pretty declarative process in terms of building the natural language processing. So we start off by defining the skill that we want to build, and then we specify the intents. And we'll talk about intents in a bit, but intents are basically the goal of the user. What are they trying to achieve? And then we represent that through giving the NLP an example training corpus of how someone would ask for that goal. So if this was, for example, a balances inquiry, I might have, what is my balance? But then I could just as easily say, how much money do I have? In this case, they're both ways we would ask for the same result, but I don't actually mention money in either of them. Likewise, we would then look at defining our entities. And again, we'll talk about entities. But what we're looking at is what's the information we need to capture to call the back-end systems. So in other words, if I'm calling my core banking system or my registration system or whatever, there's going to be a set pieces of information that I need to pass to that back-end application in order to process that information. So the entity is effectively that information we need to capture from the conversation to pass to the back-end application itself. And once we've sort of defined those two, we can actually test it within the build environment to see, is the NLP actually returning what we think it should be returning, even before we've built the physical conversation. So we always start with the natural language processing, because that's really defining the goals of what our bot is going to do. How we then build the conversation is a different exercise. And this is where the conversation designer can come in. Now, the conversation designer isn't necessarily designed for building your production bot. What it's actually designed for is working out whether the use case you're trying to build actually works as a conversation. So in many ways, it's a wireframe or mock-up tool that allows you in a he said, she said manner, the user and the bot, to walk through your use case and walk through a conversation to say, yes, this works, we can capture the right information. And this acts as a model for building your conversation flow. And we'll show you what this thing looks like when we get to a demo. Now, in Asia Pacific, language is important. So when we're building a bot, we want to make sure that the bot is able to work in whatever language our consumer is going to be in. Now, particularly when we're dealing with a G2C, we may have, like we do here in Australia, a very multicultural society. So people may ask the questions in English, but they could just as easily ask it in Chinese or Cambodian, Hindi, you name it. So we want the bot to be able to support multiple languages. And using the functionality, we can define between a runtime language and a design time language. So at a runtime, using translation services, we can actually support up to about 120 different languages. But the bot itself actually allows us to build the bot in a number of base languages. And this is an area where the digital assistant is truly state of the art, because what it means is I could start building the bot in English and then give it one of the supported languages, and the languages, we're getting more and more languages moving forward. But what it means is I can build the bot in English and then ask the question in Arabic, and it would still understand it, even without a translation engine. So the nice thing about the NLP is it's actually what's referred to as sort of zero state, which means it has enough understanding of language that it's able to cross, if you like, understand across the languages. Now, obviously, the more examples, if I then expanded and gave it some Arabic as well, it would become much more accurate. But it's able to actually work across languages. And if you're building your bot or your community is going to be someone who isn't using one of these languages, then that's where we use translation service to effectively translate the base language into, or their incoming language into the base language at runtime. Now, I mentioned the policy-driven conversation. Oracle has a tool that you might be interested in using if you're looking at a regulatory environment, which is referred to as Intelligent Advisor. Intelligent Advisor basically is a policy tool where you define the policy and it creates a conversation out of that policy. Now, that conversation is then embedded inside the digital assistant, such that if the user asks for a particular goal that is driven by policy, the policy engine takes over and the bot starts guiding the user by asking the appropriate questions. So this could be, for example, as the screenshot shows here, a diagnostic. So around COVID, asking the appropriate questions around working out whether you have COVID, or it could be a government regulatory environment or an insurance claim or something like that that you might want to push on through. But as I mentioned, the bot is going to be something where ultimately it's not going to be able to answer the user's question. So this could be for a number of reasons. It could simply be that you haven't built the answer into the bot. It could be that the user just doesn't understand the answer that you've given them and hence is starting to go round and round in circles. Or it could simply be that they asked to talk to a real person because they don't like talking to bots. But either way, you want the ability to hand over to that bot or hand the bot conversation over to a live user so they can take over that conversation and hopefully address the problem that the user might have. Now, let's get to channels. I mentioned one of the reasons bots are becoming so successful is there are lots of channels that we can address. In other words, let's put the chatbot in the environment where the user's actually working rather than have the user come to us. So in the case of an internal or a B2E bot, you might be looking at and a collaborative tool where, for example, something like Slack or Microsoft Teams, where the employees are collaborating with each other. So they're in that environment all the time. So it makes sense to bring in the bot into that environment. If we're dealing with a B2C or a G2C environment, then again, we probably want to be where the end user is. So that's going to be looking at things like the social channels, be it Facebook Messenger, be it WhatsApp, or even some of the voice channels like Cortana or Alexa. In other words, putting the bot where the user is most likely to be. Now, as I said, we currently support about a dozen or so channels natively, and we'll show, for example, how we might do a web channel. But if you're looking at perhaps going to a channel that we don't natively support, that's where the sort of classic webhook comes in, where you can plug into the channel things like Telegram, etc., which all have webhook interfaces. You can then plug that into the ODA such that if I put a message on Telegram, it's processed by the digital assistant through that webhook interface. Now, if you're looking at a collaborative environment, then frequently it's more than just a one-to-one. You also want to be able to have sort of one-to-many conversations. And that's where the concept of group chat is useful. So again, ODA as part of its channel, when we plug into products like Microsoft Teams, like Slack, then the bot can effectively become a participant in that group chat. So effectively, we add the bot in the same way as we would add a live person, and that bot is able to respond to the group or see the messages from the group as in the same way as a normal person would be. So this has a lot of benefits if you're looking at a situation where you need to effectively broadcast. Then I can send or process things in the bot and then reach out to every member of the group in one go by effectively publishing the conversation to the group. Likewise, if you're anything where you're wanting to do some form of event environment, calendars are always important. So the ability to effectively drive a calendar discussion from within a conversation, both tell me what meetings I have available, but also I need to create a meeting with Joe. So within the bot, I've specified I need a meeting with Joe, and ODA itself will do the interaction with your back-end calendaring system to create the invite that's available to Joe to come to that meeting. Now, I mentioned Alexa and Google and things like that, but Oracle actually has its own voice capability built into the product. So this is probably the most one of the most advanced voice interfaces available, and for a very good reason. The goal with our voice interface was really to look at from a what's referred to as a domain corpus or domain scope. So if we went to, say, Alexa and said, "Hey Alexa, what's the weather like in Sydney?" it would be able to understand that question, both from an NLP perspective and also from a voice recognition perspective. But if I turned around, say, for example, here at Oracle, we have the concept of key account directors, so what's just colloquially referred to as a CAD. So if I said, "Hey Google, who's the CAD for this company?" it's likely to actually return Canadian dollars because it doesn't know the concept of key account director, because that's a business concept rather than a consumer facing concept. So the function of Oracle's voice activation, not only the complexity of the voice that it can take, but also the fact that I can teach it different words such that it's going to be sort of understand my vocabulary, as well as things like names and things that are going to be useful to my business rather than just general consumer facing voice recognition. The other thing is, how do you know when you've built your bot what it's going to actually, is it successful or not? So in this case, it's very much a case of understanding what your user is doing. In other words, getting real-time view of the types of questions they ask so you can make sure you have the right questions. saw the right answers, I should say. So effectively, what this allows you to do is real time see what were the top questions people were asking, where were they coming from, and importantly, did they actually finish the conversation? Did they actually achieve what they wanted to achieve? So, in other words, did they go all the way, or did they just walk away from the conversation? Because if we're seeing that the questions they're asking are ones that the bot isn't built for, then we need to plug in another Lego block. If they're dropping the conversation, then either the conversation is too long or too complex or whatever, that the user themselves is not achieving their goal. Okay, so one thing I wanted to do, and I don't know how many of you here have built bots before, but before we get into sort of how we do it in the Oracle space, I just want to again cover some of the concepts inside the sort of what goes into a chatbot. And it's really these 5 concepts here: intents, utterances, entities, the NLP itself, and the dialogue flow. And if we look at each of these in turn, the easiest way to define an intent is the goal that the user wants to address. In other words, why did I come to the bot in the first place? So when we look at an intent, the intent really is the goal of the user, and they're going to represent that by the way they ask the question. So here, for example, we have 3 possible goals. I want to refresh my computer, I want to return my computer, or I'm going to ask a question about COVID policies with the company. So in this case, how do I go returning my desktop? Inherently, we see that as a returning of an asset. So we automatically make that that connection. But from a NLP perspective, the way we train the bot is by giving it more examples of how people would represent or infer the outcome. So here, if I'm looking at returning an asset, I could have said, I need to return my computer, and that's an obvious thing. But if we also said, I'm leaving the company, well, if I'm leaving the company, that implicitly means I got to give the computer back. So the way we train it is by giving examples of how you ask that question in the first place. Entities, as I said, are the important bits of information that we want to capture. So if I said, how do I go about returning my laptop? Well, obviously, again, that's a returning asset question. But the important thing here is, what are we returning? So we would define an entity, in this case of asset type, that says these are the possible things I could return. So in this case, obviously, how do I go about returning my laptop? Laptop is the entity that we're capturing. So the NLP is going to capture that information out of the utterance and pass it to our conversation engine. But there is a different type of entity which is extremely useful for driving conversations. And we refer to this as a composite bag entity. And a composite bag entity is effectively, rather than being a single piece of information that we need to pass to the back end, and you can think of entities in their general cases as being the parameter to the REST call, a composite bag, on the other hand, is much more a business domain as a whole. So, for example, if we had a situation where I was ordering a pizza, then a pizza has different properties. It might have the type of pizza, the size of the pizza, the type of crust, the toppings, all these sorts of things. So each one of those is effectively an individual entity. Whereas a composite bag really allows us to group all of those properties into a single real world object. And what that means is we can create one of these composite bags. And the advantage here is when we start the conversation, for example, I want a cheese pizza, please, the NLP or the conversation engine will automatically step through that composite bag and build the dialogue flow for you. So rather than having to specify the dialogue flow, you're specifying what are the questions we need to ask, and the bot will automatically step through those and ask those questions for you. So it's going to auto-generate the dialogue, but at the same time, if I said I would like a large cheese pizza, it's automatically going to jump over the questions you've already answered and only ask the question that it needs to ask. So when we look at building one of a conversation, it's not only knowing what questions to ask in the dialogue flow, it's also what questions not to ask. So in this case, the engine is smart enough to realize that if I said a cheese pizza, please, then I need to find out size and crust. But if I said a large cheese pizza, please, it's simply going to go, he's already answered pizza type, he's already answered pizza size, I will only ask pizza crust. So it's automatically only going to give the user one question and then obviously transact the order. Now, when we come to building the NLP, I mentioned that it's driven by utterances, but the NLP really is the natural language processing, but it's driven by effectively a curated training system. So we don't want a bot to just learn by whatever question you give it. If it was to learn from every question that was possibly given to it, it's very hard to stay on topic. It's very hard to stay in business domain. So imagine a situation where you had a government bot that learned from every question a citizen gave it. If enough citizens turned around and said, "Ooh, I'd like to buy a pizza. How much are the pizzas?" Then if it was learning from everything, at some point, your government bot becomes a pizza parlor. So in that case, it's all about making sure that the questions that the bot is going to answer is effectively related to your domain. So when we come to build this, and if you choose to use a chatbot as part of your hack, it's important that you design the utterances in a way that's going to make the NLP more effective. So first of all, you want the situation that more examples of asking the question is obviously going to make it better. But also don't use really short expressions. Don't use like one word or two words. I mean, for example, I was writing a chatbot for one of the coffee shops, sort of international coffee shops. And when they came to test it, many people just put the word coffee in big letters with exclamation marks. And the point being is you would not go up to a barista in a coffee shop and just yell coffee at them. You would ask for, "May I have a coffee, please?" Or "Can I have a long black?" or a macchiato or whatever. But you would actually phrase it. And the same thing holds for a chatbot. It's much more effective if you actually use real phrases that you would give to an actual human being. Using short one-word phrases or big coffee or things like that does not actually help, because single words could be used in multiple intents, and hence it's much harder for the bot to actually work out what you're talking about. But again, when you come to do the hackathon, it's important to take into account that releasing the bot is really only the start, because as soon as you have real people, they're going to ask the questions in a way that you never thought about. So it really is an ongoing learning exercise where you're going to be doing a supervised approach where every every now and then you're going to look at the questions that people have been asking and sit there and go, yes, that's a sensible question. That one makes no sense for my business. That's a correct question. That one's not. And that way you're going to teach the bot what are the appropriate questions that it needs to learn. Now, dialogue flow, as I said, the dialogue flow, we talk about the NLP, but the NLP realistically is actually two parts. It's the NLU, or natural language understanding, as well as what the processing that takes place after it. So the dialogue is really, what do I do once I've understood the user's goal? And this really comes down to effectively the context that we want to build up. And this is actually one of the big differences between, say, a Siri and a chatbot, even the first generation chatbot. And that if I ask Siri, hey Siri, what's the temperature in Sydney? It's going to be able to answer that. But if I turn around and then said, hey Siri, is it going to rain? It has no context, and hence generally comes back with, I can't answer that now. So when we design the dialogue flow, it's all about the context of the conversation, building up enough information to be able to respond to the user in the right way. Now, in the case of digital assistant, dialogue flow is defined in what's referred to as bot ML, or bot markup language. So bot markup language basically is, it's a type of YAML, or yet another markup language or YAML ain't a markup language, depending on who you talk to. But the idea is, think of a conversation as pass the parcel. So if I'm holding the parcel, I own the conversation, and the state of the conversation is with me. I pass you the parcel, you own the conversation, and effectively the state of the conversation is with you. But as we pass that parcel about, it's actually getting more context, it's getting more information. So effectively the ball that we're passing is ultimately becoming smarter as it moves around. Now, with bot ML, each one of these components is effectively a state of a conversation. So every one of these little named units here reflects the start of the conversation. So in this case, if we start with start and go there, then we can see that the first state is the system.intent. And this intent is actually how the NLP works out what we're talking about. So the system.intent is the natural language processing portion of the conversation flow that says, okay, Barry asked, what's my balance? So obviously that's about a balance inquiry. So we're going to jump to the label start balances. So it's actually almost a go-to label approach, and that we have a predefined set of conversation fragments, if you like, and it's able to dynamically jump between them based on the intent. So rather than being a hard-coded flow, it's actually going to look at the utterance, say, okay, that was a balance. So I'm going to jump to the part of my bot ML called start balances and execute the next state of the conversation. So here, for example, we can see that start balances, and start balances is listing. So if I said, what's my balance, but I didn't specify the account type, then that start balances is going to give me a pop list of here are your account types, which one do you want? But you may notice there's an NLP result variable there. And what will happen is the first thing it does is, did Barry actually mention account type in his original question? If he did, then don't print out the list of accounts and just jump straight down to the print out the outcome. So as I mentioned before, if the bot sees that you've already answered a question, it simply doesn't ask that question. And the way that's implemented is through the variable and the NLP result variable properties you see there in the start balances, the NLP result variable is my original question and effectively what's coming out of the NLP. The variable account type, if that is null, then it means I haven't actually mentioned account type before. If it's loaded, it means I had. So if I'd said, what is the balance in my savings account, then that variable account type is automatically slotted from the entity to say that Barry's talking about savings as his account type, and hence I can jump straight to go and get the outcome, or go and get the balance from the back-end financial system. Now, there are lots of different pre-built components that you use to build up your conversation flow. But ultimately, each one of these really is just a step in a conversation. And as you can see, there are ones around user interaction, there are ones around security, but there are also ones which are really just driving the conversation, like switch statements. So if I want to branch my conversation, I might use a switch or a conditions or so forth, such that by the choice of which bot ML, you're going to build out the full conversation flow, the full dialogue flow. Okay, so before we go into that, let's go and have a look at a bot. So what I'm going to do is jump over to a different screen here. So let's jump to a browser. And given that we're talking about balances and things like that, I'll show you so here we have a chatbot running inside a website. And I'm going to pop up here. And as you can see, the bot starts the conversation. So it's going to be able to say, introduce themselves. And one of the important things with designing a chatbot is letting the user know what they can actually do with it. There's nothing worse than just having an empty screen and type a message here, because I don't know what I can ask. So here I can ask questions around my credit cards and things like that. So let's start there. Let's say, how do I know how many points I have on my card? And again, in this case, that's obviously a simple FAQ, and it's come back with that. Let's have a say, I want to transfer some money. So let's say transfer money to my friend Warren. So obviously the first thing is, where's the money coming from? So I'm going to say, okay, my savings account. So it's going to start this process. How much are you going to pay? How much are you transferring? But this is where it's good to show this idea of a non sequitur, or sort of going off topic. So Lucy, who's our user here, doesn't actually know how much money is in the account. So rather than stopping what she's doing, what happens if I asked, how much is in there? Now, in this case, it's probably fallen asleep, so it's got to contact the back-end system. But the important thing here is, when I said how much is in there, I didn't actually mention which account I was talking about. So you can see that it's kept the context of the fact that we were talking about the savings account and brought the answer back for that. So if I say, okay, use that, say $100, and you can see that it came back to where we were in the previous conversation, kicked it off again, and obviously we finished that transaction there. But as I mentioned, there are many cases where you're not going to be able to do everything. So let's have a situation where it's like What do I do if I think, actually, let's show this slightly differently. Let's try the voice. So I'm going to click on the microphone here. What do I do if I think I have an invalid, oops. What do I do if I think I have an invalid charge on my card? So as you can see, the bot's responding there. We've got more information that we might want to do, some basic steps, but let's try. I don't understand. Can I talk to a human? So in this case, we can see that it's taking over. Now, if I flip to another tab, this is actually the call center agent here. So in this case, we're actually looking at the web interface to Oracle Service Cloud, for example, but it could also be a Salesforce or a Zendesk, or you name it. So you can see here that it's responded. And in fact, if we look at the bot, we can see here, first of all, that the icons change to represent we're talking to an agent. Now, in many cases, the bot is going to be able to answer it for you. So let's see, I can help with that. Let me pass you to our dispute wizard. So in other words, I'm actually, the agent's able to pass control back to the bot such that if I come along and say, well, just to show that this is what Lucy's seeing. So in this case, I'm going to tell the bot to take over, and in this case, drive a dispute. Oops, helps if I spell it correctly. Okay, so we can see it's disconnected and the bot's taken over. And this is going to be an area where we can then allow the bot to effectively walk through a wizard inside the actual conversation itself. So one of the functions you can do is incorporate form-based environments into your conversation flow. So this is obviously a very simple one here. We're going to walk through, let's say, I've been billed too much. We're going to, in this case, I'm going to select an image of a receipt. So there's our receipt. I'm going to accept that. We confirm our details. And if we move back to the conversation, you can see that it's actually created a ticket for us automatically within the help desk environment. But Lucy, our user, never left the conversation she was in. Okay, so keeping an eye on the time, how do we go about building one of these? Well, what we want to be able to do is we start off by looking at, we go into the builder, we're going to go to our development environment. This is where we define our skill. And in this case, if I was to open a skill here, oops, it's logged out. So if I was to say, take the, say a pizza bot, or let's just quickly look at my bank bot, you can see here that what we have is, first of all, a set of intents. So we specify, say, for example, the FAQs by giving it a name and then effectively pasting in the answer that would represent a question. And if we scroll down, we can actually say, here are example questions that would ultimately result in that answer. So in the case of doing an FAQ, the intent is not the question. The intent is actually the answer that is the outcome. Because remember, the intent is always the goal. It's not the questions used to get there. So in this case, we're going to define an FAQ simply by pasting in the answers from our FAQ and then giving a representative selection. Now we need at least 5 ways of asking that question. So for every intent, we're going to give 5 examples of how different people might ask that question. Likewise, if I look at balances, here, this is a simple regular intent. So we give it a name. Because it's not an FAQ, we don't specify the answer, but we do specify again how I would ask for that question. Once we've defined the intent, as I said, we go and specify the entity. So here, for example, we have account type, where I'm specifying my different account types, my checking, my credit card, my savings, as well as the synonyms that would go against that entity. So if I added, say, for example, passbook, or let's say plastic to my credit card. So let's come along here and simply add plastic. Then if I said what's the balance of my plastic, it would obviously return credit card and then pass my credit card details back to the back-end system. Once we've defined the entity, we associate that entity with the intent. So you can see here, I can go and add an entity. So this is the information I might be looking at capturing in the utterance. So we associate that, and that way the NLP engine, once it knows what the intent determination, it understands what you're asking, it can go and get the appropriate bits of information out of that. In terms of the YAML, we can see here our context variables. These are all the things that we might be capturing during that pass the parcel exercise, as well as looking at the various intents that we're going to do. So for example, here, based on the input by the user, we're going to jump to the corresponding labeled section of the application or the conversation flow. So when you design a conversation, you're really designing what's referred to as the happy path. What's all the things that a bot's going to do, and what questions do we need to ask to get there? Now, as I said, I didn't talk about or show the natural language capability, but this is what's referred to as a resource bundle, which allows us to effectively register the different ways that we might output the string. So for example, here, if I was asking which account am I transferring to, you can see that I have my English, to which account do you want to make the payment? But then I would represent my Thai, my Bahasa, my Urdu strings that effectively, if the user came in Thai, I would respond in Thai because I have appropriate resource bundles. So that allows me to optimize my bot in the language of the user. And just to prove that that does work, I'm just going to go back to, let's come back to the bot. I'm going to clear this out. And let's start this again. But in this case, let's respond with, say, Guten Morgen. So you can see that even though we didn't have German in the list of languages for output, it's able to understand that we came in German, respond in German, and tell the user, actually, I'm set up to be in English, Indonesian, Thai, and so forth. And that way you're guiding the user. Now, yes, you could do translation in both directions, but we highly don't recommend that. So there is so you use resource bundles for your customer base, and you can then look at the language on the inbound, and it's going to try again. It's going to respond in the language, but ultimately the optimized bot is going to be built in the language of your users. So hence we use resource bundles to do that. Okay, so let's just quickly go back. So the next question is, how do we go about starting? Well, the thing I would recommend here is to look at or go to our documentation. So if you start with the bit.ly Oradoc link that's on the screen there, then that will take you to our overall documentation. But if you click on the tutorials link, there's a number of tutorials that do step-by-step examples of how to build out a bot. So starting with the simple NLP pizza bot, getting through more complex use cases, including things like handing over to an agent. So between now and the hackathon, I would highly recommend going through these tutorials if you're looking at saying, well, the way we can make our application more effective from an end user perspective, and particularly in a G2C smart cities type environment, is a chatbot's going to allow non-IT people, non-technical folk to easily interact with our application. So having a chatbot is an extremely easy way of allowing sort of classic sort of non-technical citizens to be able to interact with the application you're building. And I said, starting with the tutorial is a good place to start. Okay, so at that point, we're almost bang on the hour. So I'm happy to open it up to questions, or we can wrap it up. But if you have questions, either pop them in the chat or the Q&A section, or I'm sure you can raise your hand and we can unmute accordingly. But probably the easiest place is, if you have a question, pop it in the chat. The Q&A, sorry. Okay, do we have any sandbox environment to try it out? We do actually have some sandboxes for our partners. If you're not one of our registered partners, you can actually just go and get a 30-day trial off the Oracle website. So if you go to www.oracle.com/tryit, you'll be able to get your own sandbox environment. As I said, we do have a shared environment for partners, but that's realistically just for the training purposes. You don't build projects in there because obviously they're shared. But as I said, the easiest thing to do would just be to sign up for one of the trial environments. That will last you, as I said, roughly about 30 days. But based on what you're building, it's a $300 US credit, which generally lasts about 30 days. Okay, any other questions? Okay, Suyan, do you want to wrap up here, or Stacy?